Everybody, Eliran here. Thank you for joining me. I'm going to talk about memorizing today. The topic we all love to hate, maybe? No? Yeah, I think so. Um, I have a lot to say on this, so I'm going to try to make it as concise and fast as possible. I have notes, so I'm ready. Why is this so difficult? I like to give several examples for why I think that memorizing music is so difficult. One of them is imagine that you're building this beautiful building, multiple layers and strong foundations, beautiful. You spend a lot of time building it, and then you discover it's actually on an island, and in order to get to it, you have to swim across the ocean. So the analogy here is that when we're practicing, we're building the building, and when we actually have to perform it in front of people, it's a little bit like trying to find that building through the ocean, to swim across the ocean while the storm is raging. Another very similar image I give my students is that when we're practicing, it's a little bit like conditions are, it's very similar to the first one, I have to say, but you've memorized the path to the local grocery store, and you know, you could drive it at night, you could drive it at day, but then when there's a snowstorm happening and suddenly everything is covered in white, that road becomes a lot more treacherous. In both of these examples, I think you get the picture. The idea is not so much whether we have something memorized or not, it's the idea of having to retrieve it under pressure, and that's where the challenge becomes. That's where the challenge is being able to retrieve the information at a specific point in time when you need to know what that chord is, what that note is. Okay. I guess one more point is we live in an age where we are overwhelmed with information, and maybe the expectation is that as we're exposed to the information, in this case the music, that it's just by default of being in presence with the information is going to be imprinted in our minds. And I think that in this day and age we really have to lose that assumption. It's not going to happen that way. I think concentration for all of us has become a huge issue. I know for me that the phone with the notifications, trying to practice, it's an issue, and I think it's something that maybe we are underplaying when it comes to memorization. But I think if the brain has gotten used to being constantly interrupted in the flow of things, that you're going to find yourself being interrupted as you're trying to perform the piece and play it from memory. Okay, so the way that I like to discuss memory is to talk about it in terms of layers. Like, I talk about everything in layers, so why not about memory? So layers. Let's start with the most obvious layer of memorization, which is the audio part of it. I like to think of, it's like the MP3 layer. You know what the music sounds like. You know what the melody, how the melody goes. You know the harmonies. You know what the sound world of the piece is. You've been practicing it, right? So why is that an issue? Because especially as pianists, we have multiple lines that we have to remember, and maybe the audio of the melody is very clear, but maybe the audio of the left hand is not that clear, or maybe you're hearing two chords sort of in a similar way and they have a difference between them. So yes, it's the most immediate layer for all of us, remembering what the music sounds like, but there are issues there. Next layer, the way things look. Some of us have photographic memory, so remember what the music looked like. My photographic memory is very, very strong, but I can't zoom in on a measure. I know exactly where on the page that note that I need is, but under pressure, retrieving it that way is very difficult. On the other hand, the visual memory of what the hands look like on the keyboard can also be very, very helpful, and I feel that I have that very strongly. This also ties to another level of memory, which is the kinesthetic memory. And the kinesthetic memory is not only what it looks like, but what it feels like. And this is where people refer to it as muscle memory, which is synonymous. And I think what most of us default to is a combination of the three that I already mentioned. What it sounds like, what it feels like, what it looks like. We take that as sort of a totality that happens without a lot of conscious interference from our brain. We learn the piece and that's what we remember. So what's the problem with the muscle memory? The biggest problem with the muscle memory is that we very rarely perform on the instrument we practice on. So that's a problem. You got used to one sensation, to one sort of feeling and spacing between the different keys. And now you are faced with a different instrument and might feel differently. And my favorite story is playing on a Bösendorfer that had those added 3 notes on the bottom. And my entire perspective of the keyboard changed because of those 3 notes on the bottom. And yes, the rest is history. And it's, yeah. Ask Jerry Lowenthal. Next. So muscle memory is not, it's great. And again, I think we all rely heavily on it, but it has its issues. The next level of memorization is the structure of the music. And this is where things can get wonderful or can get very complicated. I absolutely believe that knowing the structure of the piece and knowing the harmonies and knowing the way the things are constructed is essential. Like if you're playing a piece and you don't remember that the piece is in E major, you have a problem. You need to remember that stuff. The flip side of that is that when you're in the flow of things and you're playing the music and you're getting to a place where suddenly you start doubting yourself and you go, well, what's the next harmony? You might not be able to retrieve it that way in that moment because you're in the music. Being able to ask yourself that question at that point in the middle of a performance can be horrific because it can completely throw you out. So on the one hand, you must know the structure of the music. You have to analyze it, you have to learn it, you have to get that level into your system very, very strongly. As a side note, I think that people that were trained from a very early age in theory and harmony and have that ingrained into their, instinctive playing have a completely different issue. So I'm talking about the rest of us who had the harmony and theory added on at a later point. So retrieving that piece of information under pressure becomes an issue. That's the structure. Next level, emotion. I think that the most important element of the performance is being able to communicate the emotion or the conflict in the piece to the audience and sort of take them on that journey the composer intended with me during performance. That means that if I've understood the piece on an emotional level and I can connect to it and what the story or what the image or what the character of the piece is trying to convey, I'm already in a level where I understand the piece and I'm connected to the piece that is very different from just playing the notes and just understanding the structure. I talk a lot about this in the other videos, so I don't want to go too deeply into it, but for me that emotional layer is absolutely critical. And as I progress in this conversation, you'll see where I'm going to with this. Basically, I think that some of the memory issues come from an emotional transition that has not been cleared, or a difficult emotion that we can't access under pressure, or becoming suddenly self-conscious of the emotion that we're trying to convey, and not necessarily not remembering the music. So again, maybe this is a good point to stop for a second and say that not all memory slips are the same. Some are a result of the hand freezing because of a technical passage not being understood. Some of it is because I had one of those where the enharmonic spelling of the harmony suddenly in the middle of a concert threw me off. I saw an E major chord when it was indeed an F flat major chord. Yes, those exist sometimes. That sudden questioning threw me off. So yes, we need to know the structure. Some memory slips happen because of what I said earlier, the extreme transition between emotion, not being ready for a turn in the piece. Okay, so yeah, I think those are the main 5 layers. I'm going to check my notes and then I'm going to come back. Okay, pause for a second. Okay, so now let's talk about some suggestions. First of all, before we go to the suggestions, I want to wrap the other part by saying all of these multiple layers are operating simultaneously. It's not that it's like the human body. We have, the physical presence, we have our inner emotional world, we have what's happening in the brain. It's all operating together. We separate the layers because it's easier for discussion's sake to separate them into layers, but at the end of the day, it's not either or, it's and. We need to know how the piece is constructed. We need to know what emotional conflict we're trying to portray. We need to know how to move our hands to get all of this stuff together. We need to know what the music feels like, the music, sounds like, smells like, for some of us maybe. So think of the separation just for the discussion's sake, but then remember that at the end of the day, when we go on stage, we bring the entire organism with us. Okay. So suggestions. Number one, make sure that when you are playing a piece, I know this is hard, but that you have a strong connection and love for it. Why? The more you are invested in the piece, the more you feel that connection to it. That connection will sustain under pressure. I don't want to say that if you're playing a piece that you don't love, you can't memorize it. No, of course not. There's a skill involved and you should be able to apply the skill. But it's a lot easier when you actually care about the music that you're playing, when you feel that connection naturally, and then you can enhance it. It becomes an exercise of adding to something rather than trying to create something out of nowhere. So that's the first thing. Second thing, which I know is going to sound like a little silly, but make sure that you learn the piece well. If you learn the piece well, meaning you've analyzed it technically, structurally, you've worked on the emotional conflict, then you're coming to the game with a lot of knowledge about the piece. And when you're going to get to the point where you suddenly doubt something, enough of that information is going to still be there to help you get through it. So let's say you got stuck on measure 500. You remember that measure 501, the next section starts and it's the turn in the story. So you will jump to the next measure and you will be fine, which is really what this is all about. There is no such a thing as the perfect performance. I've heard many wonderful pianists perform and lose their way for a split second. And what separates the amateur from the professionals is the professionals always sort of smile to themselves and finagle their way forward and nobody knows anything happened. And again, I think the expectation that we're going to remember everything, in a full recital, everything perfectly is a little ludicrous. Of course, there are going to be moments where you waver, and those are okay. What we're working on is trying to get to the point that when those wavering moments happen, that you have enough tools in your toolbox to know how to get out of them, and also to minimize. I would say that if you experience those moments once or twice in a piece, and let's say somewhere between 4 to 10 times during a recital, that's good. If you feel that it's happening in every line, and if you feel that you're panicking about the whole thing, then you know that you are not in a good place. Okay, so let's keep that distinction going. Yes, record yourself. Recording yourself is the first stage where you expose what you've created to pressure. Because now you're going to record, you're going to listen, you're going to see if you remember, if you don't remember, if you're communicating, not communicating. And for me, that's the point that, if sort of up to that point was let's get the ingredients, and put the sugar, put the flour, and mix everything. The recording stage, we start putting it into the oven. So at first, you just put it under a low temperature to see what happens. Oh, this, not working here, not working there. And as we go with run-throughs and finally the performance, we're cooking it on a much higher level. But I think that the recording is a stage that you could do with yourself, and you can eliminate a lot of those inconsistencies or places that you go like, wait, I'm not sure what's happening in that measure. Is that an F or an F sharp? Like, where is it going? When I record myself, I find that a lot of the times it's fingering issues that have not been completely resolved. I have 2 or 3 options of fingering in my head, and I start doubting which one I should take. It happens a lot. We'll talk about intersections in a second, but it happens a lot in intersections. This is the first time, the second time, preparing ahead for those intersections. So I think recording is an incredible tool in at least identifying where those weak spots are. Yes, this is the one my kids hate the most. Play it in your head. This comes from the wonderful Don Green, who taught a class at Juilliard about performance anxiety, and I refer you to his books. He's wonderful and a tremendous amount of knowledge. He used to tell us that he worked with athletes, and the athletes used to imagine their best performance in their heads, and he encouraged us to take that to our own practice. And that for me was, I heard of other people doing it, practicing in their heads on flights, and I always thought, I don't know how effective that is. It's effective. And what the tweaks that I would add to just imagining it is, A, close your eyes, B, make sure that you are imagining a wonderful hall, a wonderful piano. Make sure that you're imagining the best performance that you can, with the most emotion, with the most expressivity, with all the colors that you wanted, with technical ease. Imagine the best performance possible that you can give without moving your hands. What happens is that you're creating this blueprint in your mind of how the music is going to unfold, what choices you're going to make or could make. By creating this blueprint, I think, I don't know the science of it, but I think you're literally creating grooves in your brain that says, this is how this is going to go. By not moving your muscles, you're shutting down the kinesthetic memory and you're telling yourself, where should I go? If your brain remembers it visually without the muscles operating, then you are a step ahead of the game. You will also have memory slips in your brain. You're going to figure out, wait, what's happening in that measure? I notice myself, it's usually the left hand. Where is that leap going to? Am I sure that I know where that next bass is? When there's a melodic connection, I'm usually okay. When there are leaps is where I start questioning things. And those are usually become obvious when I go over the music in my head. It takes a lot of concentration. It takes a lot of effort to do it. I will not do it late at night. I usually do it at the beginning of a practice session. And I think I'm going to mention a lot of tools, but for me, the most essential tool is this and the one I'm going to mention next. And I will not go on stage without using these tools and making sure that I have, strong grasp of both. Okay, let's move on. This is the masochistic memorization technique. The story goes, I went on stage and I played Brahms F minor and sonata, and I remember the first phrase sounding more like Stockhausen than Brahms because I had no idea what was going on. I recovered after the first line somehow, don't ask me how. I went to my wonderful teacher, Veda Kaplinsky, and I don't know what that was. And she said, let me tell you a story. And she tells me about how she went on stage playing Prokofiev's Second Sonata. And of course, after the first page, you can take a turn that would lead you right to the end of the movement, or you can go into the movement. And of course, she took the wrong turn and finished the movement in 20 seconds. At that point, she introduced to me this memorization technique. I don't know if I love her or hate her for it, but bear with me. Basically what you do is you go, what's the first note of the piece? You play that note, and then you throw out the next note of the piece, and you play that note, and you force yourself by not moving your hand to have your brain actually articulate what the next note is. The way I do it is I usually play both hands together. I ask my right hand what the next note is, then I do the left hand, and then I do fingerings, because again, fingerings are easier for me in a way, and are also where I find that the problems tend to be. Is it a 2 or is it a 3? Is it a jump to a 4? Is it a space? What's happening? It's excruciating. It's time consuming. It's really annoying, and I love it. It really has, from, I'd say percentages, I would say it has cleaned up my act to the point that I know that I'm going to remember the music to a 95% level because I'm doing this, because I went note by note and I checked and I rechecked and I know which finger and which note I'm supposed to be playing. Again, it's not because I don't remember the music. I think I have a very strong memory, but it's because I'm concerned with what's going to happen in a point in time where I suddenly thrown out of the piece and I have to come back in, or I suddenly lose concentration for a second and I have to get back in. It happens to all of us. With some of us it's more noticeable, with some of us it's less noticeable, but I think we all share it. And by doing this crazy masochistic memorization technique, you at least give yourself a nice boost of 20% forward to make sure that you know what it is that you're doing and what the actual notes are. My suggestion would be try it on a short piece and then play it after and see if you feel stronger about it. Of course, with everything that I'm saying, take what resonates with you and leave the rest. But I think it's really, I mean, yeah, I can say it. I think it was, when she first suggested it to me, I thought she was insane, because who is going to go through 40 minutes of Brahms F minor sonata and check note by note? But I trusted her enough to try it, and oh my God, was she right, as she usually is. So I offer this tool to you, and feel free to use it. Yeah. Yeah, intersections. I think there are enough people who talk about intersections, but intersections are the points in pieces where a phrase can go one way, and then when it repeats again, it can go another way. It's also modulations, themes appearing in different keys. My friend Spencer Meyer, in his masterclass that he gave up at Fredonia a few months ago, mentioned that he usually practices them one after the other and back and forth, so he's very, very clear about which is which and which he needs to do at a given point. I would add to that I like to put mental flags a few measures before that intersection happened, that actually a thought would come in and say, take the first turn, take the second turn. Not doing it sort of lets the autopilot and the muscle memory take over, and that could be dangerous if you're not sharp. If you've been playing for an hour already and suddenly that turn happens, you might not take the right turn. So I make a point out of circling those areas, putting those mental flags in, just to orient myself and to make sure I take the right turn. Yeah, this is an interesting one. I think when we learn the piece, we all end up with certain measures that are, say, black holes, but that are unclear. I don't know why that happens. I don't know. I know for myself that it really happens in very specific spots. I don't necessarily can tell you why those spots, but I look at that measure and go like, yeah, something happens there next. Maybe it's not that interesting. Maybe the pattern is not distinct. Maybe it's a transition moment between, we talk about transition in a second, so maybe it's a transition moment, but I think we all have it. I would say that out of the 100% of the piece, there are usually 5% that go into this gray area, and those are dangerous, because those are moments that on stage you suddenly go, oh, hello, nice to meet you, who are you, I never heard you before, and they can really, really mess you up. So when you record yourself, you would usually figure out what those areas are, and then your job is to ask yourself the simple question of, what's happening here? Identify a pattern, identify a fingering pattern or a musical pattern, a scale, an arpeggio, a chord. Ask yourself, what is this pattern doing in context with before and after, and just give yourself a little bit more information. That usually works for me, just by saying, oh, gray area, what's happening here? But I know that those measures tend to stay in the gray area unless you address them directly. So my advice is just make sure that you don't leave them in the gray area or in the black hole, whichever way you want to call it, and shed some light on them. Just look at them for a second, find something concrete about them that can stick in your memory, and then continue. Yes, this is maybe the most volatile of all the comments I want to make on this subject, and that's was one of my biggest revelations after I wrote my doctorate and I started working with the circles and the emotional transitions and waves, is that I discovered that a lot of my memory slips, again, I think that's the wrong term to call them, memory gaps of the inability to retrieve the information in a specific moment, would happen in emotional transitions. So what does that mean? Let's say the music was I'm going to be very simplistic, so please forgive me. Going all the way from very sunny and bright suddenly to very dark, or from very dark to suddenly very bright. I think what happens is that we invested so much energy in creating one mood that letting go of it in transitioning to a different mood sort of takes the body and the mind into crises, shall we say. We don't want to leave what we've created. So unless you tell yourself, okay, my character was very happy, they had their birthday party, and now there's a funeral. Unless you tell them that they're now switching moods, you're going to want to stick with what you've created. You're not necessarily going to want to make the transition. I'm mentioning it because it repeated in several pieces, and every time I looked at where that spot happened, it wasn't an emotional transition. And I can also tell you that it didn't really matter if it was from up to down or from down to up. They're both equally difficult. The solution is to be alert that the transition is happening and let go. So I know I'm going to have to drop into a darker emotion, let go of the positive emotion and allow that transition to happen, and vice versa. So I encourage you, look at the music, and if you know a place that you're a little shaky, look at the emotional wave and look at what the change between emotion, if there is a change between emotion. Another point that goes under this category is if emotion is too intense. At the end of the day, yes, it's music and yes, it's a stage, and we're not really experiencing the emotion as we would in real life. It's not really a war. It's not really a broken heart. We are creating art, right? I think for the body, it doesn't really matter. I think that if we are like actors, we've convinced ourselves that we are in a certain reality. If we are experiencing grief or we're experiencing joy, the body believes it, and hopefully the audience believes it too. My point, if you're going into a dark emotion or a sunnier emotion and you can't sustain it, you're probably going to check out, and that's going to result in a memory slip. Again, it's not a memory slip, it's a disconnect. The body's going to say, I don't want to go there, I don't want to do this, check out. You're going to maybe laugh, but I would say that for me, it was really the more positive emotions that were problematic than the negative emotions. I think it's personal. I don't think there's a rule here. But if my image encapsulated the depth of the emotion and I practiced that depth of emotion, I wouldn't check out. If I felt that the emotion was out of my range and I couldn't really express it, there would be friction and at some point maybe a total disconnect. I pose that to you, play with it, see if this resonates, and and of course if you have questions, just leave them below. Run-throughs correlates to what I said in recording. I used this analogy in a lesson once and I think the student almost fainted, but the idea is that when you're presenting a piece, it's like, that raw piece of meat that you throw in the pan when the oil is sizzling and you hear that tss. That's what we all experience when we expose a piece for the first time in front of an audience. Be one person, two people, a full hall. There is this feeling of the body cringes, the piece sort of shrinks into, like a much tighter, I don't know what word I'm looking for, but it becomes much tighter and you really feel like that attention of everybody is sort of searing what you've created. So number one, it's a natural part of performing, of preparing a piece. There is the raw piece where you're working, cooking it, and then there is the actual, putting it out in the fire and see what happens. So we first have to get over that hurdle. Two, we can make it gradual. Let me say it again. We can make it gradual. You don't have to go from, freezing cold to, boiling flame. You can gradually get the temperature to go up. So you play for your best friend who doesn't judge you. You play in studio class where, yes, everybody's judging you, but they're still your friends. And then you take it to a larger audience. My number is, I would say, somewhere between 5 and 10. If I feel like I've done small run-throughs, I played it for a couple of friends, I played it for a colleague, played it for a small group of people, I'm ready to go. I have not done this in many years to jump straight into the water with no run-throughs, and I don't, recommend it to anybody. I know there's some courageous souls out there who do it. Bravo to you. I don't belong into that group, and I don't encourage my students to belong to that group. I think that preparation and that gradual process is what creates consistency and what actually allows you to be more creative eventually. So run-throughs are important. Yes, stations. Stations is the idea that throughout the piece you've identified several spots that you can just start from. So sonata form, the beginning of the first theme, beginning of the second theme, beginning of the development, beginning of the exposition. I don't have to add. This is more semantics. You could have a spot every line, or you could have 3 spots in the entire piece, depending on the length of the piece and what makes you feel comfortable. But I think just labeling those spots that you can just enter from, regardless of what happened before, I think that's really important. And I know because this is happening a lot with some students, going back and repeating the section you just forgot doesn't fix things. We can only move forward. So in fact, if you suddenly lost your spot and you jumped to a next section, that's more seamless than you fumbling, going back, repeating what we just heard and moving forward. Why? It's a matter of perception. It's not the test is not to show that you remember all the notes. The test is to show that you remember the notes in sequence, and in order of events. Again, the stations are therefore helpful because they can allow you to enter seamlessly, sort of, through, as you're progressing through the piece. Okay, hopefully that's clear. Yeah, I think that's all I want to say about this for now. If you have questions about any of the points that I've raised here, remember the goal is to be able to go on stage with confidence that you know the notes, that you know the piece, that you know the fingering, that you have something to say with it. It's not being anxious, but it's the enthusiasm of sharing something and knowing that it's going to be done under pressure elevates us, but also stresses us out. So you have to accept that as the entire package. And I think if you come to it prepared, there could be a really wonderful, uplifting, inspiring moment. And if you come to it unprepared, it could be a really devastating moment. Yeah, and I think everything that I mentioned to you right now are tools that I've used on myself, tools that I use with my students, and I found them to be tremendously helpful. I know what I forgot. When you're on stage, and I'll make a separate video about dealing with performance anxiety, but this is, I think, an important point to mention in this context. Part of the problem, again, is our attention as we're performing the piece from beginning to end. You're starting okay, you're fine, and then you get to a place where there's multiple lines and a lot of chords and a lot of jumps and counterpoint, and your brain is, oh my God, what am I supposed to do here? I found that if you process the piece with the following two intentions or awarenesses, voicing and placement, and you activate those before you start playing the piece, you will have a thread that carries you throughout. What do I mean by that? You should just take a very simple, melody and accompaniment. You're going to voice the right hand over the left hand, so you're listening to that balance. You're going to place the rhythm of the melody or the rhythm of the bass, whichever way you feel more comfortable, and you're going to listen to that. Those two ideas will carry you throughout the piece. I call it like holding the rope. You need a concrete plan to get you from the first note to the last note, and by following the voicing and the placement of the notes, you allow your brain to focus on something that is constructive in the moment and to not pull you out by telling you, well, what's the next harmony, or what's the next note, or are you ready for that modulation? Oh my God, you messed up. You shut that down, you shut the inner monologue, because it's really unhelpful at that point, and you focus on obviously the story they created, the emotion you're trying to depict, and you are in a sort of a Zen situation where you're listening and placing and voicing and placing. And when you get to that very difficult passage where there are a lot of chords, a lot of counterpoint, you have a plan. You know that you're bringing out, let's say, the middle line. The top line has to be a little softer. The bass has to be really, really soft. And you're just listening to that progression. That hierarchy will carry you through that passage, through that section, and really throughout the piece, because the brain is busy doing something. Again, I'll make another video talking about other things to do while you're performing, but I think that's really helpful because, again, the memory happens in multiple ways, but that nagging thought that happens to all of us, and the more intelligent you are, I think the more nagging it is. Do you know what the next harmony is? Do you know what the next note is? Do you know what the next phrase is? That is unhelpful. It's either you know it or you don't. At that point, it's too late to introduce the information. But a constructive thought, it says, where we are in the story, or what are we trying to say, or what's the voicing, or what's the rhythm, or are the spaces between the notes supposed to be even or uneven? Are we stretching? Those constructive thoughts can help you go throughout the piece without collapsing into this questioning mode. With that, I'm going to leave you. Thank you for listening to this very long ramble on memorization. Share your experiences, share your thoughts, leave me questions, and I'll see you next time.